The hands that once gripped rifles were now extending food through the wire, fingers trembling despite themselves. Refusing meant protecting pride, but accepting meant breaking everything they had been taught to believe. Here, pride could have won, yet hunger had already beaten pride. Sometimes kindness doesn't feel like mercy. Sometimes it feels like a burden, a heavy one. That morning, the air inside the camp carried the same weight. Not relief, not hope. Just a quiet pressure that settled on the chest and made breathing feel deliberate. Prisoners stood motionless, ribs pressing against thin uniforms, eyes fixed to the ground as if looking up might invite punishment. Hunger has a sound of its own, not loud, subtle, a tightening stomach, a dry swallow, a pain that never fully leaves. By the later stretch of the war, camps like this were running on limits of supplies, of strength, and of belief. The camp itself had learned how to be silent. When the wind moved, the barbed wire answered with a faint hum. Wooden watchtowers creaked like tired bodies. Somewhere in the distance, a tin cup tapped softly against a fence post, nudged only by the breeze. Days here weren't measured by time anymore. They were measured by endurance, hunger, cold, waiting. For the Japanese prisoners, capture wasn't just a military defeat. It was a wound to honor that refused to close. They had been taught that surrender erased dignity, and that surviving captivity carried its own kind of shame. Every step inside the wire reminded them of that lesson. They avoided each other's eyes, not out of anger but because mirrors were hard to face. Survival now demanded a price, and no one was sure how to pay it. On the other side of the fence stood the American guards. Most of them were young, faces worn thin by distance and repetition. Orders sat in their pockets while memories crowded their minds. Letters from home, photographs folded until the edges softened, the sound of radios playing songs from a life that felt far away. They had been told to keep distance, to observe, to control. But distance becomes difficult when hunger is written plainly on another man's body. Rations were never enough, not for anyone. Bread was counted, portions measured. Every bite belonged to someone's need. The guards knew this. When they ate, they chewed slowly, aware that food was more than fuel, it was comfort. And alongside that awareness came another feeling, quieter but persistent, unease. The kind that follows you like a shadow. That morning, the routine broke. There was no announcement, no command, just a small movement that shouldn't have mattered but did. Food was passed through the wire, not thrown, not dropped carelessly, offered. A simple act, hesitant, as if the hand itself wasn't entirely certain it was allowed to do this. The prisoners froze. Training warned them not to trust it. Experience whispered that kindness often hides pain. And the pride they had left urged them to stand firm, to refuse, to prove something to themselves. But hunger doesn't listen to speeches. It doesn't understand ideals. It speaks a simpler language, one the body understands all too well. Eyes lifted slowly. Not to the guard's face, but to his hands. They were shaking. That detail mattered. It meant this wasn't easy on the other side either. This wasn't an order being followed. It was a choice, one made because he'd seen suffering up close and couldn't ignore it. No one moved. Seconds stretched thin and fragile like paper. The camp held its breath again. Inside that silence lived everything the war had broken: fear, mistrust, the violence that lingered even when weapons were quiet. Accepting the food meant admitting something dangerous, that the enemy could be human, and that survival might come from the very hands they had been taught to hate. Then something shifted inside one prisoner. Not hope, just instinct. He stepped forward slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter the moment. Fingers closed around the food, uncertain, almost apologetic. No cheers followed. No words, only the sound of breathing, uneven but real. That single act didn't end the war. It didn't restore what had been lost, but it changed the shape of the day. And sometimes that's how history moves, not through speeches or victories, but through small choices made when no one is watching. Because when hunger wins, everything else has to answer to it. And what followed that choice was far more than just a meal. If this story made you pause, if it stirred something quiet inside you, share it with someone who still believes history is only about battles. This is history captured. A single piece of food crossing the wire didn't end the silence. It made it heavier. What followed wasn't relief. It was hesitation. The kind that lingers when something unexpected has already happened and no one knows how to react to it yet. The guards returned to their posts. The prisoners drifted back to their places. But the camp itself felt altered, as if it were holding onto a breath it hadn't planned to take. Some prisoners turned away as they ate, shielding their faces, embarrassed by how quickly their bodies responded. Hunger eased, but dignity didn't follow as easily. Others chewed slowly, forcing each bite to last, afraid that finishing too soon would make the moment disappear. Around them, no one stared. Everyone understood what was being protected. That night, the camp didn't truly sleep. Even in deep rest, eyes snapped open without warning, and heavy moments came rushing back. Memories arrived uninvited, home streets, familiar voices, evenings that once felt ordinary. The body lay still, but the mind wandered restlessly, retracing paths it could no longer reach. Hunger had quieted, but absence had grown louder. On the guard side, sleep was uneven too. Rations were counted again, more carefully this time. Portions felt smaller even before they were eaten. No one spoke openly about what had happened earlier, but it sat between them, unacknowledged and undeniable. Some guards avoided eye contact altogether, suddenly unsure where to rest their eyes. Guilt has a way of revealing itself without saying a word. By now, the war had dragged on long enough that certainty felt worn thin. Orders still existed, but belief in them no longer felt automatic. The lines were still clear on paper: guard and prisoner, control and obedience, but reality inside the camp had begun to blur them. The next day, food was shared again, quietly, carefully. Not everyone rushed forward. The prisoners waited, watching for signs, measuring intention. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces, an extra second of pause, a hand that didn't pull back too quickly, a gesture that didn't feel rehearsed. At one point, a prisoner stopped before lifting his cup. He hesitated, then looked up. For the first time, his eyes met a guard's directly. No anger, no gratitude, just recognition. The guard nodded once, almost imperceptibly. That was all it took. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In moments like that, the camp felt different, not safe, not kind, but changed. As if something fragile had been placed between both sides, something that required care simply to remain intact. Everyone knew it couldn't last forever. Hunger would return. Orders could change. The war was still the war. But for now, something small had shifted, quietly, without permission. And the longer it remained, the harder it became to pretend nothing had happened. Because once silence starts to speak, it's impossible not to listen. And what began as a single act of restraint was slowly becoming something else, something the camp itself was not prepared to name. The truck arrived without warning. Dust lifted as it rolled to a stop, settling slowly over the camp like a held breath. New boots hit the ground, new uniforms, new eyes that didn't yet understand this place but were already measuring it. Conversations died instantly. Bodies straightened. The camp remembered what it was supposed to be. Food distribution stopped. For the prisoners, that pause was louder than any shout. Hunger didn't need time to return. It was already there, tightening its grip, reminding them how fragile the last few days had been. What they had begun to accept as routine now felt temporary again, like something borrowed that could be taken back at any moment. On the guard side, movement slowed. Hands rested more carefully. Eyes stayed forward. Every action felt exposed. The small choices that had once passed unnoticed now carried weight. Sharing food was no longer just an act, it was a risk. And risk feels different when someone is watching. The inspection began. Boots traced the fence line. Fingers tapped clipboards. Questions were asked quietly, but nothing about them felt gentle. The officers didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Authority filled the space on its own. One guard caught himself adjusting his stance, suddenly aware of how close he stood to the wire. Another shifted his ration bag farther back, as if distance alone could erase intention. No one spoke, but everyone felt the same tension. This moment could undo everything. For the prisoners, waiting became unbearable. One of them held his cup but didn't lift it, not yet. Hunger pulled at him, sharp and familiar, but fear pressed harder. Accepting food now felt different than before. It felt visible, exposed, as if choosing to eat might draw attention he couldn't afford. Time stretched thin. Eyes moved cautiously between guards and officers, searching for signs. A raised eyebrow. A pause that lasted too long. Anything that hinted at what was allowed and what wasn't. In war, permission often matters more than intention. Then it happened. An officer stopped near the fence, his gaze settling briefly on a prisoner who hadn't eaten. The look wasn't angry, it wasn't kind either, it was curious. The kind of curiosity that makes people freeze, unsure which version of themselves is safest to show. The camp held its breath. Nothing was said. No order was given. The officer moved on. Only after he left did the air seem to loosen, slowly, carefully, as if relaxing too quickly might invite attention back. Food distribution resumed, but it wasn't the same. Movements were smaller now, quieter, every gesture carried awareness. The prisoner finally lifted his cup. He drank without looking up, hands steady despite the tension in his chest. Across the fence, a guard noticed, and for a brief second their eyes met. Not in relief, not in celebration, just acknowledgement. We're still here. That glance didn't change the rules. It didn't erase the fear, but it confirmed something fragile had survived being watched. By the end of the day, the truck was gone. The officers had left with their notes and their silence. The camp returned to its uneasy rhythm, but no one forgot how close everything had come to snapping back into place. Because once kindness has been tested, it never feels accidental again. And from that moment on, every shared ration carried a new question. Not just can we do this, but how long before someone stops us? The inspection ended without punishment, and strangely, that made the silence heavier. Relief didn't arrive all at once. It hesitated. Bodies remained tense, as if the camp itself wasn't convinced the danger had passed. People stood still longer than necessary, waiting for the moment to truly be over. Sometimes the absence of harm takes longer to process than harm itself. Food distribution resumed later that day, but it wasn't the same. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was obvious. Guards moved carefully now, measuring every step, every pause. Kindness hadn't disappeared, it had simply learned how to hide. Portions were adjusted quietly. Hands lingered for a second longer, then pulled back. Everything was done in a way that looked ordinary because ordinary was safer. For the prisoners, the changes showed first in their bodies. They didn't collapse as often anymore. Standing felt slightly easier. Breathing came with less effort. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden strength returned. Just enough energy to remain upright, to make it through another count, another hour. Survival, they were learning, rarely looks heroic. Living isn't dramatic, it sounds simple when told, but it's brutal when endured. Across the fence, one of the guards noticed the difference. Helping had done what punishment never could, it had kept people alive. And that realization carried its own weight. Offering food hadn't erased the rules, but it had blurred something inside him. He hadn't expected gratitude. What unsettled him was responsibility. Once you help someone survive, it becomes harder to pretend their survival doesn't matter. Sometimes his eyes followed the prisoners longer than necessary, not out of curiosity, but out of uncertainty, as if he were quietly asking himself a question he wasn't ready to answer. Occasionally, a glance crossed the wire, brief, unplanned, no smiles, no apologies, just recognition. A reminder that something small had happened here, something neither side could fully undo. No one spoke about it. No one needed to, because small acts done in the hardest moments don't disappear. They stay. A kindness offered at the worst possible time has a way of lasting longer than the moment itself, even when it comes from someone you never expected it from. By nightfall, the camp had settled back into its uneasy rhythm. Orders still existed. Fences still stood. The war was still the war. But underneath it all, something fragile remained intact. Not hope, not peace, but memory. And memory, once formed, is difficult to erase. Whatever came next, both sides would carry this moment with them. Not because it was loud, but because it was quiet and real and human. By the time the season began to shift, the camp didn't look different, but it didn't feel the same either. The fence was still there. The watchtower still creaked. Counts were still taken. Orders still lived in pockets and on tongues. From a distance, you could have said nothing had changed. Yet anyone who stood close enough could sense it. The air carried memory now. That's the strange thing about places like this. They don't announce transformation. They absorb it. A prisoner sat one evening with his back against the barracks wall, turning a dented tin cup slowly in his hands. Not drinking, just holding it, feeling the cold metal, tracing the rim with a thumb as if that tiny circle could explain what words couldn't. A cup shouldn't mean anything, but in this camp it did. It was proof that a moment had happened, and that it hadn't been imagined. Outside, a guard paced his usual route, boots dragging lightly through the dirt. He had walked the same line 100 times, but now he caught himself listening differently. The wire's faint hum in the wind, a cough from the barracks, the soft shuffle of feet. He'd once heard those sounds as background. Now they landed like reminders. Because once you feed someone, even once, it becomes harder to pretend they're only a symbol. Not everyone on either side knew what to do with that truth. For some prisoners, the shame still burned. They had been raised on certainty, on the idea that surrender erased honor, that captivity was a stain you carried forever. And yet their bodies had accepted the food anyway. Not proudly, not gratefully, simply because the body doesn't negotiate with starvation. Living isn't dramatic. It sounds simple when told, but it's brutal when endured. And when the mind finally caught up to what the body had done, it left questions no one wanted to speak out loud. How do you tell this story if you ever make it home? How do you explain that the enemy, who you were taught would crush you, offered a piece of their own ration instead? That's another thing people don't understand about war. It doesn't just break bones, it breaks narratives. It ruins the neat lines, good and bad, strong and weak, victory and defeat, and replaces them with something messier. A guard unfolded a letter one night, then paused before writing. The paper was there. The pen was there. But the words didn't come easily. How do you describe a place where compassion feels dangerous? Where mercy has to be disguised as routine? He stared at the blank space, then folded the letter back up as if silence was safer than honesty. Days went on. The war still existed beyond the camp, loud and unstoppable. But inside the wire, something small kept repeating, quiet choices made carefully without applause. And that's what lasted. Not the names, not the ranks, not the arguments people would later have about who was right. What stayed was a trembling hand offering food, a man freezing before he reached for it, a breath held by an entire camp. Years later, people would forget dates. They'd forget the exact shape of the towers or the layout of the yard, but they wouldn't forget what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, when they expected only cruelty. Because a small kindness given in the worst moment doesn't fade. It follows you. A short act in a hard time can stay for a lifetime, even when it comes from someone you never expected it from. And maybe that's the part worth carrying forward. Not to soften what war is, but to remember what human beings can still be, even inside it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes history is only about battles and winners. This is history captured.